train arrived at Union Station on the morning of March 14, 1919. Among the returning soldiers who stepped onto the platform, one man moved differently than the others. His name was Samuel Voss, and he carried no duffel bag, no rifle, no identification beyond a single military transit paper that identified him as Private Samuel Voss, 28th Infantry Division, recently discharged from a field hospital in eastern France. The records show that his sister, Margaret, met him at the station. She would later tell a neighbor that he looked at her for a long moment before speaking, as if he'd forgotten her face. When she embraced him, she said, he did not embrace her back. On the ride home to their mother's house in South Philadelphia, Margaret asked him about the others, about Henry Callahan and Otto Brenner and Jack Moss, the three men from their neighborhood who'd enlisted the same day Samuel had, in the spring of 1917. They'd promised to look after each other. People in the neighborhood still talked about the photograph taken outside the recruitment office. 4 young men, arms slung across each other's shoulders, grinning like they were heading to a baseball game. According to Margaret's later testimony to a visiting officer from the War Department, Samuel looked out the window of the streetcar and said, "They didn't come back." She asked him what happened. He turned his head toward her. She remembered his eyes were different, not in color but in the way they rested on her face. She said it felt like being looked at through water. "I don't want to talk about it," he said, and for the next 42 years, until his death in 1961, he never did. The historian tasked with reconstructing this story, a doctoral candidate named Elizabeth Kern, working in 1978, began with a simple question. What could make a man refuse to speak about the deaths of his closest friends for an entire lifetime? Kern had access to Samuel Voss's military records, declassified in 1972. She had his sister's fragmentary testimony. She had interviews conducted in the 1950s by a journalist who'd become obsessed with the case. She had the sparse, bureaucratic language of the War Department's letters to the families of Henry Callahan, Otto Brenner, and Jack Moss, all 3 declared missing in action, later amended to presumed dead. What she did not have was a single word from Samuel Voss himself. His silence was absolute. It was noted in every document. Margaret Voss described it. His mother died asking for an answer and never receiving one. A chaplain who visited him in 1920 reported that when asked about his service, Samuel politely excused himself from the room and did not return. Kern's dissertation, filed in 1979 at the University of Pennsylvania, is titled The Silence of Samuel Voss, Survivor Testimony and the Limits of Historical Reconstruction. It is a careful, meticulous, and ultimately inconclusive work. But it is the only attempt to reconstruct what might have happened in the Argonne Forest in the autumn of 1918, when 4 men went in and only 1 came out. The first thing Kern established was that Samuel Voss was not coerced into silence. There was no official gag order. The army had no record of disciplinary action against him. He was honorably discharged. His medical records noted exposure and malnutrition, but no psychiatric diagnosis. In 1919, the language for what we now call trauma did not yet exist in military files, at least not in any systematic way. The second thing Kern established was that people tried repeatedly and with increasing intensity to make him speak. Margaret tried. Their mother tried. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer tried in 1920, showing up at the family's door with a notebook and a photographer. Samuel's mother answered. The reporter asked if Samuel would speak about the fate of his 3 friends, whose families were still waiting for closure. Mrs. Voss said her son was not available. The reporter returned the next day, and the day after that. On the 4th day, Samuel himself came to the door. The reporter, a man named Clarence Duff, described the encounter in his notes. He is thin and very pale. When I introduced myself, he nodded. I asked if he would share what happened to Callahan, Brenner, and Moss. He said, "No, I will not." I asked why. He said, "Because it won't help anyone." Then he closed the door. Duff wrote that he knocked again, but no one answered. The families of the missing men did not give up as easily. In May of 1919, Otto Brenner's father, a machinist, went to the Voss house and demanded to see Samuel. Mrs. Voss tried to turn him away, but Samuel came downstairs. The two men stood on the porch. Otto Brenner Sr. was a large man, a Union man, unaccustomed to being denied. According to a neighbor who witnessed part of the exchange, Mr. Brenner did not shout. He spoke very quietly. He said he just wanted to know if his son had suffered. He said he needed to know if Otto had been afraid. He said he would not judge Samuel, no matter what had happened. Samuel, the neighbor recalled, stood very still. He looked at Mr. Brenner for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I can't." Mr. Brenner asked, "Can't or won't?" Samuel did not answer. Mr. Brenner left. He never returned. Jack Moss's mother wrote letters. Kern found 11 of them in Samuel's effects, donated to a local historical society after his death. They span from 1919 to 1924. The first are pleading, the later ones are angry. The final one, dated November 1924, is a single sentence. "I forgive you for whatever you did." There is no record that Samuel ever responded. Henry Callahan's family took a different approach. They did not contact Samuel at all. Henry's younger brother, Michael, told an interviewer in 1953 that the family had decided early on that if Samuel wasn't talking, there was a reason. "Maybe he was protecting us," Michael said. "Maybe what happened was worse than not knowing." Michael Callahan paused in the interview, then added, "Or maybe he was protecting himself." Kern interviewed Samuel's niece, Margaret's daughter, in 1977. The niece, by then a woman in her 60s named Catherine, remembered her uncle as a quiet, kind man who worked as a bookkeeper and lived alone in a small apartment in Fishtown. She said he came to family gatherings but never stayed long. He was polite. He brought gifts for the children. He did not drink. Catherine said that once, when she was a teenager in the 1930s, she asked him directly about the war. They were sitting on her mother's porch. It was summer. She asked if he'd been scared. He looked at her and said, "Yes." She asked what had scared him most. He stood up, kissed her on the top of her head, and left. She said she never asked again. The one piece of testimony that suggests violence, or the threat of it, comes from a man named Albert Ross, who worked at the same accounting firm as Samuel in the 1920s. Ross told the 1950s journalist that one afternoon, a man came into the office looking for Samuel. The man was rough-looking, Ross said, with a heavy accent. Polish or Russian, he thought. The man asked where Samuel Voss sat. Ross pointed. The man walked over, leaned down, and said something Ross couldn't hear. Samuel went very pale. He nodded. The man left. When Ross asked what that was about, Samuel said, "Nothing." Ross said Samuel was shaking. Ross also said that Samuel did not come to work for 3 days after that, and when he returned, he had a bruise along his jaw. When Ross asked if he was all right, Samuel said, "I'm fine." Kern attempted to track down any record of this encounter, but found nothing. Ross himself died in 1971. There is no way to verify the story, but Kern noted it in her dissertation as one of several incidents suggesting that Samuel's silence may have been enforced. By whom and why remains unknown. By the mid-1920s, the neighborhood seemed to accept that Samuel Voss would never speak. The families of the missing men stopped asking. The reporters moved on. Samuel lived quietly, worked steadily, and avoided attention. But the silence itself became a kind of presence. People noticed it. They shaped their lives around it. Margaret stopped hosting large family dinners because Samuel wouldn't come. Catherine learned not to talk about the war in his presence. The men at his office stopped inviting him to the bar after work, not because he'd refused, but because his presence made them uneasy in a way they couldn't articulate. One co-worker, in an interview years later, said, "It was like he was holding something. Like if he opened his mouth, it would fall out, and we'd all have to see it." Elizabeth Kern's dissertation does not argue for a single explanation. Instead, it catalogues the possibilities. Perhaps Samuel Voss deserted, and his friends died because he was not there to help them. Perhaps he survived through an act of cowardice, abandoning them, hiding while they fought. Perhaps he survived through an act so brutal that he could not reconcile it with the man he wanted to be. Perhaps he made a choice in the forest, A terrible choice, and lived with it in silence because speaking it aloud would make it real in a way he could not bear. Or perhaps, Kern suggests this carefully near the end of her work, perhaps what happened was not shameful at all. Perhaps it was simply unbearable. Perhaps he stayed silent not to protect himself, but to protect the families from a truth worse than uncertainty. Kern writes, "We assume silence is evasion, but sometimes silence is the last act of care a person can offer." When Samuel Voss died in 1961, his niece Catherine was the one who sorted through his apartment. She found very little: a few books, some clothes, a photograph of the 4 young men outside the recruitment office, kept in a drawer beneath folded handkerchiefs. On the back of the photograph, in Samuel's handwriting, were 4 words: "I'm sorry. Forgive me." Catherine kept the photograph. She showed it to Kern in 1977. Kern asked her what she thought it meant. Catherine said, "I don't know, and I don't think he wanted me to know." To understand Samuel Voss's silence, Kern believed, one had to understand what he was before the war, who he was with the men who did not return, what they were to each other. The neighborhood where they grew up, South Philadelphia near the Navy Yard, was dense, loud, and tightly knit. Irish, Italian, Polish families lived shoulder to shoulder in narrow row houses. The men worked at the shipyard or the factories. The women took in laundry or worked in the textile mills. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Samuel Voss was the youngest of 3 children. His father, a shipfitter, died in 1908 when Samuel was 12. After that, Samuel worked, delivering papers, sweeping floors at a butcher shop, anything that brought in money. He was a serious boy, according to neighbors. Quiet, responsible. He finished school, which not everyone did, and took a bookkeeping course at night. Margaret, his older sister, described him as the one we all leaned on. When their mother became ill in 1915, it was Samuel who managed the household accounts, who made sure the rent was paid, who walked their younger brother to school every morning before heading to his own job. He was not particularly social. He did not drink or gamble. He went to church with his mother. He read books. A neighbor remembered him sitting on the front steps in the evenings, reading by the streetlight. But he was close, deeply close, to 3 other young men. Henry Callahan lived 2 doors down. He was a year older than Samuel, the son of a dock foreman. Henry was loud where Samuel was quiet, impulsive where Samuel was cautious. He had a wide, easy smile and a reputation for talking his way out of trouble. He worked at the Navy Yard alongside his father, but everyone knew he wanted more. He talked about going west, about seeing the country, about getting out of Philadelphia. In a letter written to his mother from training camp in 1917, Henry described Samuel as the smartest man I know. He wrote, "Sam thinks about things. The rest of us just do them. If I ever get in real trouble, he's the one I'd want next to me." Kern found that letter in the Callahan family papers, donated to the archives after Henry's mother died. It is one of the few pieces of direct testimony about Samuel from someone who knew him before the war. Otto Brenner was different. Stocky, serious, the son of German immigrants, Otto was the kind of boy who kept his head down and worked. He apprenticed as a machinist and was good at it. Precise, patient, steady. His father wanted him to stay out of the war. Germany was the enemy, and the Brenner family felt the weight of that in the neighborhood. People whispered. Some stopped buying from the Brenner family's corner store, but Otto enlisted anyway. He told his father he was American, and that was all that mattered. Samuel and Otto were not obvious friends. Otto was blunt, unsentimental. Samuel was careful, thoughtful, but they respected each other. A former classmate remembered seeing them sitting together on the steps of St. Thomas Church, talking quietly while the other boys shouted and roughhoused in the street. The classmate said they were the kind of friends who didn't need to fill the silence. Jack Moss was the 4th. He was the youngest, just 17 when he enlisted, and he lied about his age to do it. He was small, wiry, with a sharp wit and a habit of making jokes that walked the line between funny and mean. He worked as a delivery boy and spent his money on cigarettes and picture shows. Jack's mother, in one of her letters to Samuel, described her son as wild. She wrote, "He wouldn't listen to me, but he listened to you. In the same letter she wrote, you were supposed to keep him safe. The four of them were not inseparable. They did not spend every moment together, but they orbited each other. They were the boys who met on the corner after work, who walked together to the baseball games, who sat in the same pew at church. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the neighborhood erupted. Flags appeared in windows. Recruitment posters went up on every corner. Young men lined up at the enlisting office, swept up in the momentum of it. Samuel Voss did not rush to enlist. He was 21, supporting his mother and younger brother. Margaret was engaged, planning to marry in the fall. Samuel had responsibilities, but Henry Callahan enlisted in May. Otto Brenner followed a week later. Jack Moss, lying about his age, went down to the office and signed his name in late June. Margaret later said that Samuel came home one evening in July and told their mother he'd enlisted. She asked why. He said, because they did. She asked if he thought that was a good reason. He said, it's the only one I have. The photograph taken outside the recruitment office in July 1917 shows four young men in civilian clothes, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning. Henry is in the middle, his head thrown back in laughter. Otto stands to his left, smiling but composed. Jack is on the far right, small and cocky, chin lifted. Samuel is on the far left. He is the only one not looking at the camera. He's looking at the other three. Kern studied that photograph for a long time. She wrote in her notes, Samuel's expression is not one of joy. It is not fear either. It is something closer to attention. He is watching them. The four men trained together at Camp Dix in New Jersey. Letters from Henry and Jack survive, sent home to their families. Henry's letters are full of complaints about the food, jokes about the officers, stories about the other men in the unit. He mentions Samuel often. Sam keeps us out of trouble, he wrote in August. The sergeant loves him because he's the only one who can add. Jack's letters are shorter, brasher. In one, he brags about a fight he got into with a man from New York. He writes, Sam and Otto pulled me off him before I killed him. Henry said I'm an idiot. Maybe I am. Otto's family kept no letters. His father burned them after Otto was declared missing, unable to bear reading them. Samuel wrote home every week, but the letters were brief and dutiful. He asked about his mother's health. He sent money when he could. He did not describe training, did not mention the other men, did not share his thoughts. Margaret said the letters felt like reports, not correspondence. It was like he was checking a box, she said, making sure we knew he was alive but not letting us in. The 28th Infantry Division shipped out to France in May 1918. They arrived at a staging camp near the village of Prauthoy in eastern France and spent the summer in reserve, training, waiting. The men wrote less frequently. The letters that survive from this period are brief, weary. Henry wrote to his mother in July, It's hot and boring and the food is worse than camp. We're fine, don't worry. Jack wrote to his mother in August, We haven't seen any fighting yet. Sam says that's a good thing. I think it's boring. There are no letters from Samuel during this period. In September, the division was moved to the Meuse-Argonne sector, where the final Allied offensive of the war was beginning. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and relentless. Entire companies were chewed up in the dense forest. Men disappeared into the trees and did not come out. The last confirmed sighting of Samuel Voss, Henry Callahan, Otto Brenner, and Jack Moss together was on October 8, 1918. They were part of a patrol sent into the Argonne forest to scout German positions ahead of an infantry advance. The patrol consisted of 12 men. Only Samuel Voss returned. The official record of what happened on October 8, 1918 is sparse and contradictory. The after-action report filed by the company commander notes that a 12-man patrol was dispatched at 0600 hours to reconnoiter enemy positions approximately 2 kilometers north of the American lines. The patrol was led by Sergeant William Hayes. The men carried rifles, grenades, and rations for one day. The report states that the patrol did not return by nightfall. A search party was sent out at dawn on October 9th. They found no sign of the patrol. On October 11th, Private Samuel Voss walked out of the forest alone. He was taken to the battalion command post, where he was briefly questioned by the company commander, Captain Robert Finch. No transcript of this conversation exists. Captain Finch's notes, discovered by Kern in the National Archives, consist of a single line. Private Voss states the patrol was ambushed, no other survivors. Samuel was sent to a field hospital for observation. He remained there for 2 weeks, then was transferred to a larger hospital near Paris. In December, he was shipped back to the United States and discharged. The other 11 men, including Sergeant Hayes, Henry Callahan, Otto Brenner, and Jack Moss, were listed as missing in action. In 1920, their status was changed to presumed dead. No bodies were ever recovered. This is what the official record shows. It does not explain what happened in the forest. Kern attempted to reconstruct the patrol's movements using maps, weather reports, and testimony from other soldiers in the division. The Argonne forest in October 1918 was a nightmare. The trees were dense, old-growth oak and beech, their canopy so thick that even in daylight the forest floor was dim. The undergrowth was tangled with vines and thorns. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The weather on October 8th was cold and wet. A light rain had been falling for days, turning the ground to mud. The men would have moved slowly, carefully, trying to stay quiet. German forces in the area were dug in, desperate and well-armed. They had machine gun nests, snipers, and booby traps scattered throughout the forest. Patrols were dangerous work. Men vanished regularly, but 12 men vanishing at once was unusual. Kern found one witness who might have seen the patrol before it disappeared. A soldier named Leonard Pitts, who was part of a different unit stationed nearby. In an interview conducted in 1953, Pitts said he remembered seeing a group of men moving through the trees on the morning of October 8th. He couldn't say for certain it was the same patrol, but the timing and location matched. Pitts said the men were moving in single file, spread out, weapons ready. He said they looked tense but disciplined. He watched them for a few minutes, then lost sight of them in the trees. He said he heard gunfire later that day, rifle fire, then the stutter of a machine gun. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then silence. Pitts said he reported it to his sergeant, but they were under orders not to move from their position. He never saw the patrol again. When asked if he remembered anything else, Pitts said, "Yeah, I remember thinking they were moving too fast, like they were trying to get somewhere before dark." The question Kern kept returning to was simple. What happened after the gunfire stopped? If the patrol was ambushed, where were the bodies? German forces did not typically take that many prisoners in the chaos of the Argonne. If they had, there would be records, interrogation reports, prisoner transfers, something. If the men were killed, why was there no sign of them? The Americans combed that section of forest in the weeks after the armistice. They found shell craters, abandoned equipment, and the remains of other missing soldiers. But they found nothing from the October 8th patrol, except Samuel Voss. The field hospital where Samuel was first taken kept minimal records. The attending physician, a doctor named Martin Keller, noted that Samuel was suffering from exposure and dehydration. He had cuts on his hands and face, consistent with moving through heavy brush. His uniform was torn and filthy. He had lost weight. Dr. Keller wrote, "Patient is alert but uncommunicative, responds to direct questions with minimal answers. Affect is flat, no visible wounds requiring surgery. There is no mention of interrogation, no indication that anyone pressed him for details." Dr. Keller added one more line, almost as an afterthought. "Patient appears to be in a state of shock. Recommend rest and observation." The only other testimony from this period comes from a nurse at the field hospital, a woman named Grace Howard. She was interviewed by the 1950s journalist, though by then she was elderly, and her memory was uncertain. She said she remembered Samuel because he did not speak. Most of the men talked, about home, about the war, about their pain. But Samuel was silent. She said she tried to comfort him once, after she found him sitting outside the hospital tent, staring at the forest. She asked if he was all right. He looked at her and said, "I don't know." She asked if he wanted to talk. He said, "No." She said he looked at her for a long moment, then added, "Thank you, though." Grace Howard said it was the saddest thing she'd ever heard. Kern also found a brief mention of Samuel in the diary of another soldier, a man named Thomas Briggs, who was recovering at the same field hospital. Briggs wrote on October 14th, "There's a fellow here who came out of the forest alone. They say his whole patrol is gone. He doesn't talk to anyone, just sits there. You can tell he's seeing something the rest of us aren't." Briggs did not mention Samuel again. The most tantalizing piece of evidence, and the most unreliable, comes from a letter written by Sergeant William Hayes's widow in 1921. Hayes was the patrol leader, the man who would have been in charge when things went wrong. Mrs. Hayes wrote to the War Department requesting more information about her husband's death. In the letter, she mentioned that she'd heard rumors, she did not say from whom, that one of the men from the patrol had returned. She wrote, "If this is true, I would like to speak with him. I need to know if my husband suffered. I need to know if he was brave." There is no record that Mrs. Hayes ever contacted Samuel, or that Samuel responded to her letter, but the phrasing of her request is telling. She did not ask what happened, she asked if her husband was brave, as if she already suspected that bravery might not have been enough. Kern's reconstruction of the final moments of the patrol is necessarily speculative, but based on the terrain, the weather, and the testimony of men who fought in similar conditions, she sketched out a possible sequence of events. The patrol moved north into the forest, following a crude map. They were looking for German positions, trying to get close enough to observe without being seen. It was slow, nerve-wracking work. At some point, perhaps an hour in, perhaps two, they were spotted. A machine gun opened up. The men scattered, diving for cover, returning fire. The firefight was brief. Leonard Pitts said 2 minutes. That suggests the patrol was overwhelmed quickly. After the shooting stopped, there would have been silence. Men calling out to each other, checking for wounded, trying to regroup. And then, what? Did the Germans advance, capturing or killing the survivors? Did the patrol scatter, fleeing deeper into the forest, where they died of wounds or exposure? Did something else happen? Something so terrible that Samuel could never speak it aloud? Kern does not speculate further. She simply notes, "The silence begins here." The only clue to Samuel's own movements comes from the condition of his uniform when he arrived at the field hospital. Dr. Keller noted that the tears in the fabric were consistent with someone moving through dense brush for an extended period. Samuel's hands were cut, his knuckles scraped, his boots were caked with mud. This suggests he walked a long distance, that he moved through the forest alone for at least a day, possibly longer. The question is, why alone? One possibility, raised by the 1950s journalist, is that Samuel ran. That when the shooting started, he panicked and fled, leaving the others to die. This would explain his silence. Shame is a powerful silencer. But Kern found this explanation unsatisfying. Samuel was not a coward. The men who knew him, Henry, Otto, Jack, trusted him. His sister described him as steady, reliable. Even the letters from training camp suggest a man who took responsibility seriously. And if he had simply run, why would the army discharge him honorably? Why would Captain Finch's note say only "no other survivors," with no hint of blame or suspicion? Another possibility is that Samuel survived by chance, that the machine gun fire missed him, or that he happened to be far enough from the ambush to escape, that he tried to help the others and could not, that he searched for them and found nothing. This would explain his silence as grief, as guilt for living when they did not. But it does not explain the look in his eyes when he returned. It does not explain the way people described him afterward, as if he were carrying something. The third possibility is the one Kern found most compelling, though she could not prove it. That Samuel made a choice in the forest. That in the chaos and terror of the ambush, he had to decide between staying and running, between trying to save the others and saving himself. That he chose survival and lived the rest of his life knowing what that choice cost. Kern wrote, "Silence is not always the absence of an answer. Sometimes it is the answer." Samuel Voss returned to Philadelphia in March 1919, and the city did not know what to do with him. The war was over. The soldiers were coming home. The streets filled with parades, banners, speeches. Mothers hung gold stars in their windows for sons who would not return. Fathers stood on porches, waiting for boys who were already buried in foreign soil, and Samuel walked among them, silent. The pressure to speak began immediately. Margaret met him at the station. By that evening, neighbors were knocking on the door, asking questions. Mrs. Callahan wanted to know if Henry had been in pain. Mr. Brenner wanted to know if Otto had died honorably. Jack Moss's mother wanted to know if her boy had been scared. Samuel told them all the same thing. "I don't want to talk about it." Margaret later said she tried to intervene, to tell the neighbors that Samuel needed time. But they kept coming. Some were kind, some were angry. Some accused him of cowardice, of abandoning their sons to save himself. Samuel stopped answering the door. In April, a representative from the War Department visited the Voss household. His name was Lieutenant Edgar Mills, and his job was to gather testimony from returning soldiers about missing men. The families had a right to know, Mills explained. They deserved closure. Mills sat in the Voss family's small parlor and asked Samuel to describe what happened on October 8th. Samuel said, "We were ambushed. The others didn't make it." Mills asked how Samuel had escaped. Samuel said, "I don't remember." Mills, according to his own report filed with the War Department, pressed further. He asked about the sequence of events. He asked about the German positions. He asked if Samuel had seen the bodies of the other men. Samuel said, "I don't remember." Mills asked if Samuel was refusing to cooperate. Samuel said, "I'm telling you everything I can." Mills wrote in his report, "Private Voss is either unable or unwilling to provide useful testimony. Recommend case be closed." The case was closed. The families did not accept this. Otto Brenner's father, as mentioned earlier, confronted Samuel on the porch. Henry Callahan's mother wrote letters to the War Department demanding a full investigation. Jack Moss's mother wrote directly to Samuel, begging him to tell her anything, even if it was painful, even if it reflected badly on her son. Samuel did not respond. By the summer of 1919, the neighborhood had begun to turn against him. It was subtle at first. People stopped greeting him on the street. Mothers pulled their children aside when he walked past. The men at the corner store fell silent when he entered. Margaret said it was like watching someone become a ghost while still alive. There were incidents. In June, someone painted the word "coward" on the front steps of the Voss house. Margaret scrubbed it off, but the paint had soaked into the stone. You could still see the letters for years. In August, a group of men, friends of Otto Brenner, cornered Samuel outside the factory where he worked. They did not touch him, but they surrounded him, demanding answers. One of them, a man named Frank Dulac, shouted that Samuel owed them the truth. Samuel stood very still. Then he said, "I don't owe you anything." Frank Dulac later told a reporter that Samuel's voice was calm, almost gentle. He said it made him angrier than if Samuel had shouted back. The men let him go, but Frank said, "We all felt like we'd lost something, like he'd taken it from us." The worst incident occurred in October 1919, on the first anniversary of the patrol's disappearance. A service was held at St. Thomas Church for the missing men. The families gathered. The priest spoke about sacrifice, about honor, about the boys who gave everything for their country. Samuel attended. Margaret begged him not to go. She said it would only make things worse. But Samuel went anyway, sitting alone in the back pew. After the service, as people filed out, Jack Moss's mother saw him. She walked over, and for a moment, Margaret thought she was going to embrace him. Instead, she slapped him. The sound echoed in the church. Everyone stopped. Mrs. Moss looked at Samuel, tears streaming down her face, and said, "You should have died instead of him." Samuel did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and then he walked out. Margaret followed him home. She said he went straight to his room and did not come out for 2 days. When he finally emerged, she asked if he was all right. He said, "I'm fine." She asked if he wanted to talk. He said, "No." By 1920, the neighborhood had largely given up on getting answers. The families settled into grief. The war receded into memory. Samuel became a fixture, a quiet, solitary man who worked, attended church, and avoided conversation. But the silence remained a wound. Catherine, Samuel's niece, said that even as a child she understood that her uncle was different. She said people spoke about him in whispers, the way they spoke about tragedies. She said her mother once told her, "Your uncle carries something heavy. We don't ask him to put it down." Catherine asked what he was carrying. Her mother said, "I don't know, and neither does he, maybe." There were moments when it seemed Samuel might speak. In 1922, a veterans group invited him to share his story at a meeting. They promised it would be private, just other soldiers, men who would understand. Samuel attended the meeting, but left before his turn to speak. In 1925, a priest, Father O'Malley, who had known Samuel since childhood, tried to draw him out during confession. Father O'Malley later told Margaret that he'd suggested Samuel's silence might be a form of penance, and that speaking might bring him peace. Samuel said, "Silence is my peace." Father O'Malley said he didn't ask again. The most troubling testimony comes from 1928, nearly a decade after Samuel's return. A man named John Carlin, who worked with Samuel at the accounting firm, said that one evening after work, he and Samuel were walking to the trolley stop when a car backfired. The sound was sharp, sudden, like a gunshot. Samuel dropped to the ground. Carlin said it happened so fast he didn't understand what he was seeing at first. Samuel was on his hands and knees, breathing hard, staring at the pavement. Carlin helped him up. Samuel's face was pale, his hands shaking. Carlin asked if he was all right. Samuel said, "I'm fine." Carlin said, "That sounded like the war, didn't it?" Samuel looked at him. Carlin said the look was strange, almost grateful, as if Carlin had named something Samuel couldn't. Samuel said, "Yes." Carlin asked if he wanted to talk about it. Samuel said, "No." They rode the trolley in silence. Carlin said that was the only time Samuel ever acknowledged the war in his presence. By the 1930s, Samuel had become almost invisible. He lived alone in a small apartment in Fishtown. He worked as a bookkeeper for a textile company. He had no close friends. He attended family gatherings but never stayed long. Margaret said he was kind to her children, that he remembered their birthdays, that he helped with homework. But she also said he seemed distant, as if he were watching them from behind glass. She said once, in the late 1930s, she asked him if he was lonely. He said no. She asked if he was happy. He said, "I don't think about it." When World War II began, Catherine, by then a young woman, asked her uncle if he thought about the First War. He said, "Every day." She asked what he thought about. He said, "The same thing." She asked what that was. He said, "The people who aren't here." The pressure to speak never entirely disappeared, but it changed shape. By the 1940s, no one expected Samuel to talk. The families had stopped asking. The neighborhood had stopped caring. But the silence itself had become a fact, a permanent part of Samuel's identity. People spoke about him as the one who came back, not the one who survived, not the veteran, just the one who came back, as if returning was all he had done, as if the rest of his life was an afterthought. In 1953, the journalist who became obsessed with the case, Clarence Duff, the same man who had knocked on Samuel's door in 1920, tried one last time. Duff was older now, semi-retired, but he'd never forgotten the story. He tracked Samuel down at his apartment and wrote him a letter. He said he wasn't trying to expose him. He just wanted to understand. He asked if Samuel would meet with him, off the record. No names, no publication, just a conversation. Samuel wrote back. It was the only written response he ever gave to anyone about the war. The letter, preserved in Duff's papers, is brief. "Mr. Duff, I appreciate your persistence, but I will not meet with you. What happened in the forest is not something I can explain, and even if I could, I would not. Some things are better left unsaid. Please do not contact me again." Respectfully, Samuel Voss Duff did not contact him again. But in his notes, found after his own death, Duff wrote, "I believe Samuel Voss is the most honest man I've ever encountered. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's choosing silence, and I think he's right. Samuel Voss died on a Tuesday in February 1961. He was 65 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. He was found in his apartment by a neighbor who noticed that his newspaper had not been picked up for 2 days. Catherine, his niece, was the one who handled the arrangements. She said the funeral was small. Just family, a few co-workers, and Father O'Malley, who had known Samuel since childhood. At the service, Father O'Malley spoke briefly about Samuel's kindness, his reliability, his quiet presence in the community. He did not mention the war. Catherine said that as they were leaving the church, an elderly woman approached her. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Henry Callahan, Henry's mother, now in her 80s. Mrs. Callahan said she wanted Catherine to know that she had forgiven Samuel, whatever he had done or not done. She said she understood that some burdens were too heavy to share. Catherine thanked her. Mrs. Callahan added, "I think he protected us. I think that's why he never spoke." Catherine asked what she meant. Mrs. Callahan said, "I think the truth would have been worse than the silence." When Catherine sorted through Samuel's apartment, she found very little. He had lived simply, almost Spartanly. A few books on the shelf, mostly histories and biographies, some clothes, a small radio. No photographs, except for the one in the drawer. The photograph of the 4 young men outside the recruitment office. On the back, in Samuel's handwriting, "I'm sorry. Forgive me." Catherine kept the photograph. She did not show it to anyone for years. When Kern interviewed her in 1977, Catherine said she'd spent a long time thinking about those 4 words. She said, "I used to think he was apologizing for surviving, but I don't think that's it." Kern asked what she thought now. Catherine said, "I think he was apologizing for something he did, or something he didn't do, and I think he knew we'd never forgive him if we knew what it was." Elizabeth Kern's dissertation, completed in 1979, does not solve the mystery of what happened in the Argonne Forest on October 8, 1918. It does not identify Samuel's crime, if he committed one. It does not explain his silence, except to suggest that silence itself was the point. What Kern's work does, carefully, methodically, is reconstruct the shape of the void. She traces the outline of what is missing. She shows us the people who ask questions, the answers they did not receive, the ways they learned to live with uncertainty. In her conclusion, Kern writes, "We assume that truth is always preferable to silence. We assume that speaking is an act of courage and that silence is evasion or cowardice. But Samuel Voss's silence was neither evasion nor cowardice. It was deliberate. It was sustained. And it was, I believe, an act of care. He chose not to speak because he understood that some truths do not heal. They wound. They reopen grief. They replace ambiguity with certainty, and sometimes ambiguity is more bearable." The families of Henry Callahan, Otto Brenner, and Jack Moss spent decades wanting to know what happened to their sons. But I suspect that if Samuel had told them, they would have spent the rest of their lives wishing they didn't know. Silence, in this case, was not the absence of an answer. It was the answer. Kern's dissertation was not widely read. It was filed in the university library, cited occasionally by other scholars, and largely forgotten. But in 1981, a copy of the dissertation reached Michael Callahan, Henry's younger brother, now an old man himself. Michael wrote to Kern. He thanked her for her work. He said he'd spent most of his life angry at Samuel Voss for not speaking, but that reading her dissertation had changed his mind. He wrote, "I think you're right. I think Sam was protecting us. I think he saw something or did something or knew something and he decided we were better off not knowing. I'm not sure I agree with his choice, but I understand it now." Michael ended the letter. "I forgive him. I wish I could have told him that." Kern kept that letter. In her papers, donated to the University of Pennsylvania after her death in 2003, there is a note attached to Michael's letter. It reads, "This is the closest we will ever come to an answer. Not what happened, but why Samuel chose silence. He was not protecting himself. He was protecting them. And maybe, in the end, that's the only truth that matters. The question remains, of course, What happened in the Argonne forest on October 8, 1918? Did Samuel Voss abandon his friends to save himself? Did he watch them die and do nothing? Did he make a choice, a terrible, necessary choice that haunted him for the rest of his life? Or did something else happen? Something we cannot imagine, something so far beyond the normal calculus of courage and cowardice that language itself would fail to capture it. We do not know. We will never know. Samuel Voss took the answer to his grave, and in doing so, he ensured that the families of Henry Callahan, Otto Brenner, and Jack Moss would never have to carry the weight of that knowledge. He carried it alone. In 2005, a researcher working in the French National Archives uncovered a set of previously unexamined records from the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Among them was a brief intelligence report dated October 15, 1918, filed by a German officer named Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler. The report mentions a skirmish on October 8th, in which a small American patrol was engaged. Kessler notes that several Americans were killed, and that German forces took no prisoners due to the intensity of the fighting. He adds one detail. One American soldier was seen fleeing the engagement. Pursuit was not possible due to heavy fire from the American lines. The report does not name the soldier. It does not describe him. It simply notes that one man escaped. This report was shared with Kern's colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, who forwarded it to Catherine, Samuel's niece. By then, Catherine was in her 90s, living in a nursing home. She read the report. Then she wrote a short note to the researchers. "This doesn't change anything. He still chose not to speak. And I still think he was right. What do we owe the dead? What do we owe the living?" Samuel Voss spent 42 years balancing those debts. He carried the memory of 3 men who did not come home. He endured the anger of their families, the suspicion of his neighbors, the weight of his own silence, and he never spoke, because some truths, he understood, are not gifts, they are burdens, and sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer is to carry the burden ourselves, so that others do not have to. In the end, we are left with a photograph. 4 young men, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Henry Callahan, bright and loud. Otto Brenner, steady and serious. Jack Moss, small and cocky. And Samuel Voss, looking at them instead of the camera, his expression unreadable. They are frozen there, in July 1917, before the war, before the forest, before the silence. And on the back, in Samuel's handwriting, "I'm sorry, forgive me." Not an explanation, not a confession, just 4 words, carrying the weight of a lifetime. We do not know what Samuel Voss was sorry for. We do not know what he wanted forgiveness for. We do not know what happened in the forest. And because Samuel chose silence, we never will. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the silence itself is the story. Perhaps in refusing to speak, Samuel Voss gave the only answer he could, the only answer that would allow the people he loved, and the people who loved the men who did not return, to continue living. The silence was not emptiness. It was care. It was protection. It was, in its own way, the truth.